Hello, my name is Gary Scudder, a professor here in the Corps. This is not actually my office. I'm sitting in the excellent Cindy Brandenburg's office at her desk right now, being assisted by the truly much more excellent Kelly Thomas, who, well, we can't. Today I want to talk about something that I do in Core 220. That is aesthetic expression, which is a class I absolutely love. One of the things that I do in that class, since we can now make them more personal, is I always call mine global lenses. And what I do is, even though the class is about the Western aesthetic, I tend to bring in other lenses to look at. Like we look at the Indian aesthetic, we look at the Navajo aesthetic, we look at the Japanese aesthetic. And the reason why I'm doing this is to give a fuller picture. Because I've always said this, I mean, as much as I like the second year, the one essential flaw in the logic is this notion that I think if you just look at the West, the students don't understand truly what makes the West unique. Because the West is unique, for better or worse. And I think so. I think I've always done this in all my classes in the second year. I'd always included non-Western stuff because, one, I think it gives the West more context, but also because it's just something that I find more interesting. And it's now that we can officially personalize them, I'm much more dramatic in my use of it. And I tend to make tremendous use of this book, Richard Anderson's book, Calliope's Sister. And I end up using about 5 chapters of it. And I think it's great. We'd already used this chapter on the quartet of Western traditions, and I've just now added several more. I used it a couple different ways. The big thing is I make use of them when I'm doing in-class analysis, where I'll show a work of art, and I will have the students analyze it. So they have to come in having read the chapter, and then they just look at a work of art or a couple works of art and analyze it using the criteria of that particular aesthetic. Now, why do I do this? I do this for a couple of reasons. One is I like to throw more of the learning into the lap of the students. I don't like the idea of, okay, we read a chapter, let's come in now and I'm going to tell you what it said. I want the students to more actively take charge of their own learning. And I also want them to learn how to read a chapter, analyze it, and pull out the conceptual tools. There are tools in every chapter that you can use in your analysis, and I want to work on this skill. The reason why I like, and the one I tend to do first, is a Navajo aesthetic, because I think it's sort of a gracefully written chapter, and it gives the students something to think about. By way of preface, I mean, I'm not going to read the entire chapter, but there are a couple interesting sections I want to read from this book. Again, this is on the Navajo aesthetics. That in itself leads to an interesting discussion, because why do we view Navajo as a non-Western aesthetic? If Navajo is truly a non-Western aesthetic, then this means that all of the mainstream American aesthetic is completely borrowed. Because why are we drawing this distinction? Anyway, one of the things they talk about is the Navajo sense of beauty. And they have a very specific notion of it. And it's not necessarily the classic Western concept of me trying to achieve beauty or striving for beauty. The Navajo would be based more on the notion of just living beauty. So art should be a case of finding beauty in a very, very natural, unforced way. In a couple passages that Anderson quotes in the book, here's a line, and this is a very common Navajo prayer, which says, "With beauty before me I walk. With beauty behind me I walk. With beauty above me I walk. With beauty below me I walk." So when you look at Navajo art, you're going to be looking at beauty, but not the deliberate attempt to find beauty. Instead, the more casual, organic notion of just showing beauty. It also says this. As one scholar said, the Navajo do not consider the generation or maintenance of beauty to be particularly elusive. Beauty is in the nature of things, as well as in people. It is in the normal state of affairs. The gods designed this world to be a beautiful, harmonious, happy, and healthy place. To be maintained, beauty needs to be expressed and renewed in ritual, song, art, speech, dress, and in daily living. I think especially the descriptive words beautiful, harmonious, happy, and healthy are some of the real foundations of what successful Navajo aesthetics should be about. Real briefly, what's also intriguing about this is the notion of what aesthetics mean in a very real sense. And it gets into gender, which is something I think is a really nice discussion with the students. For instance, again, this is from Anderson chapter on Navajo aesthetics, page 127. It says, Navajo men are considered to be static. And this belief is reflected in the stylistic conservatism seen in the sand paintings men make. For a sand painting to be effective, it must replicate in almost every detail the designs that have been handed down from previous generations, because Navajo men are more static. But he also points out that Navajo women are considered to have dynamic natures, at least as compared to Navajo men, and women's art reflects this belief, in contrast to the traditional designs that men faithfully copy in their sand paintings. The lively minds of women always produce new patterns for their weavings, never replicating a pre-existing work. So you're laying out some very different visions. So what do? When we do the in-class analysis, I show them two objects. I show them a sand painting, and I show them a Navajo rug. And what I tell the students is this. I say, okay, you run a small museum. You have exactly enough money and space to show one work of Navajo art, and only one. So of these two, which one best fits the Navajo aesthetic? You have 55 minutes to make this argument. Now, which one do I want them to choose? I don't care which one they choose. By definition, there is no correct answer. What I want them to do is grapple with the criteria. And what's nice about this choice is it allows them to pursue this in all sorts of ways. Yes, you can look specifically at some of the very specific criteria, like for instance, sort of asymmetrical symmetry, if you want to think about it that way, sort of whirling symmetry that you see. Like we think of symmetry in a very deliberate way in the West, but Navajo aesthetics talks about symmetry in a very different way, sort of whirling symmetry. So you can talk about that. But I also like the fact that in looking at these two very, very different works of aesthetics, you end up having to make tough decisions. For instance, it allows you to bring in gender. Like if the students have read the chapter at all, they know that by definition a sand painting is going to be done by a man. And we know that the rug almost by definition is done by a woman, so you get to bring in gender issues. You get to talk about the fact that one is much more conservative and traditional, and the other is much more free form and innovative. You also get to talk about the fact that one is much more collectivist. It's very common for a sand painting to be done by a whole group of men, whereas the rug by definition is done by one woman. You also get to talk about the notion of art as process, because as soon as a sand painting is done, it is destroyed. It is not meant to be around, whereas the rug is meant to be around forever. Now, so you have 55 minutes to do this. I tell the students they have the first half hour to grapple with the objects themselves and the Anderson book. At a half hour in, you're allowed to actually open the internet and go out and bring in things. I always tell them I do not want a Wikipedia dump. So as part of that first half hour discussion, you need to think about exactly what it is you want to look for when you're out on the net. So I'm trying to teach them also the transferable skills of a more deliberate, specific analysis. Anyway, I'll be doing more core talks in this, and I'll be talking about other aspects of other aesthetics. Now, obviously I think I'm unique in 220 in that I do all of these other aesthetics. Most people do not take that approach. Having said that, even if you just did one of these, say you borrowed one of Anderson's chapters and did the Indian aesthetic or the Japanese aesthetic or the Yoruba aesthetic, and just did one, even if you don't do all the others, I think it'd be remarkably valuable for giving the students something else to think about as they're looking at the Western aesthetic. I have PowerPoints for this. I have folders on ArtStore. I'm happy, as always, to talk to folks in this about greater detail. So please feel free to drop me a line, and I am finished, and the excellent Kelly Thomas will push the button. Thank you.